I'd like to take a little more philosophical approach to this issue of the military talks, their contribution to peace, possible methodologies. I think we must begin by first looking at at how the militaries think, the prism through which the military minds work, because that certainly is an important element in trying to understand how they will respond to the threat perceptions that each one will perceive. I think that it is true for every military in the world that they think of war, but while they think of it, going to war, it is not something that is in their comfort zone. Therefore, all effort is made by them to make it sound so horrible that you eventually end up avoiding that. And therefore, this process of reaching that end comes about by the militaries viewing each other as adversaries. And in the India-Pakistan context, if we don't see each other as enemies, we certainly do see each other as adversaries. And in Pakistan's case, I do not think that one should mince words by saying that, yes, it's not the principal adversary. It is unfortunately the nature of the professions to be able to come up with an enemy, to focus your entire developments around that enemy. And this is an observation that was reinforced by comments that were made by several friends of mine when I trained with the Australian Army, when I trained with the Canadian Army, when I trained and collaborated with the other people in the United Nations. Everyone came round and told me, oh, how lucky you are as a military man. How lucky you are, you have an enemy that you can relate to. And our problem is we don't have an enemy. We don't know what to do with our military and ourselves. So it's an important element to consider when the military mind works. It's also, I think, necessary to recognize that the military advice that is given is always based on the worst case scenarios. And therefore, there are extreme elements to the responses that are developed. There is an overestimation of own capabilities, and there is an underestimation of the enemy's capabilities, which are again inherent in the responses that we build. And we try to be optimistic. We try to overplay our own response. What that leads to is, and that's really the point that I'm trying to make, is that in the security perspectives, this can lead to some major miscalculations. And this is a caution that I think our leaderships, whether they are political or whatever, the leadership in every country that has embittered relationships must be aware of. Because there are decision makings that may either be compelled by fears of consequences, or they would be led into moderations and inactions through those very fears. Now we go into how we think that is this therefore necessary for us to get together, to be able to talk to each other, to be able to understand each other, so that the cobwebs in this rather hostile environment within which the military mind is working and coming up with options and responses for the political decision makers to adhere to, whether these will help. And I would like to go back to the time when I think there was no better CBM or military-to-military dialogue processes than the ones that we had at the formation of our two countries. My father, who was also in the military, served in the military with Indian officers, but fought against those very Indian officers as the Indians did against Pakistan. They served in the same units. They served during the World War together, fighting a common enemy, and then ended up fighting each other. they understood one another far more than any one of us can ever do. Because we will never end up serving in the same units. We will never ending as one Sikh officer was my father's best friend, and the one whose wedding gift, since he was the best man at his wedding, my father carried to his last days in his pocket. It was beautifully embroidered wallet that he always kept with him, because it was that gentleman who had given it to him. Despite that, he was taken prisoner in the 1965 war, and Colonel Singh was in the custody directly of my father. And at that time, all these relationships did not matter. What mattered were the impulses that governed our policies and impulses that drove our threats, perceptions, and so on. Therefore, when we talk military to military, I think we need to temper our enthusiasm with that reality that it can never be there. NATO and Warsaw Pact similarly met, but they saw no change in actual threat perceptions. I think it is also important to recognize that when we talk military to military, who is it who meets one another? How is that particular individual supported or facilitated? How influential he is within the circles? Because that will determine and dictate the value of participation that those people have. I do think that it is good for atmospherics, but this is not something that is substantive. It's not something we should pin our hopes on, pin our expectations on, that if we have a good military to military dialogue going, it is something that will be very useful to the peace process. Because what is necessary to make that happen is that it must be part of a larger process, an overall enabling environment. And this is the only environment within which I think conflict resolution can be intended by the governments and then mandated. And you work within that overarching environment. Now, what happens is that in our history, and we've talked about the 66 years, I cannot agree more with Air Marshal Putney. We need to tackle big issues. These cosmetics simply act as lengthening the fuse pending this resolution. And therefore, we may eventually end up and see the CBMs being used as escape mechanisms, and this was mentioned earlier today also. But they are themselves, I think, being used as a substitute for substantive progress on major issues. They end up slowing the breakdown and crisis, certainly, in an intermediary environment. But what they do also enable us to do is to offer an alternative to the application of force. And it is this insecurity that needs, I think, our attention, rather than focusing more on the CBMs. And therefore, I come down to those issues that I think bedevil. From a Pakistani perspective, we see India certainly in an asymmetric development. And therefore, while we are conscious, as any military professional or as any security professional would be, of your legitimate security needs, of your size, of your need to be larger, what we cannot understand is the asymmetry that is created vis-a-vis Pakistan. We are not looking at this as a zero-sum game, but we do see And we do debate what is rational to the Indian perceptions of security and what is rational to the threat that Pakistan may pose to it. And therefore, when I see 80% the Indian development forces arrayed against Pakistan, I have to take cognizance of that. When I mentioned this at an earlier forum, one of my colleagues came back in the next meeting, said, well, General, you were wrong. It's not 80%, I've checked back, it's 65% that's arrayed against you. And only last month he came back and he told me, actually we raised 2 mountain divisions against China. And therefore we are now down to 55%. And he said, I asked him, I said, these 2 additional divisions that you're moving to China, are they coming out of those facing Pakistan? They said, no, these are additional. I said, then don't do the accountant's mathematics with me. Because we can play these number games. The fact is that there is $8 billion being spent in developing infrastructure that is offensively poised towards the south of Pakistan. We need an explanation. You may very well have a very logical explanation for it. You may have a very logical explanation for the mechanized forces that you've developed, the armored forces that you've developed, the airfields that you developed, the kind of weapons that you have amassed. But this is far beyond a legitimate requirement in the opinion of the Pakistanis. And therefore there is a need for that dialogue to be set in place to say, all right, yes, we understand this asymmetry, because what it gives rise to is that an asymmetry must either be matched through an arms race, or it must then transcend into a qualitative shift. And that qualitative shift is unfortunately far more dangerous and far more devastating and catastrophic for the subcontinent than we can ever imagine. This is coupled. So you have an asymmetry in forces, you couple that with aggressive doctrines, and aggressive doctrines that are trying to capture a very narrow window of opportunity in terms of my own Indian colleagues saying, we want to cash in on a 72-hour window of opportunity against Pakistan. And that's military language that we speak. And we are talking about cold start, its development then into a proactive operations, and a converse or a reactive development in the Pakistani military of the new war fighting doctrines. So these doctrines by themselves become far more or more and more destabilizing as they are fielded. They lead to new strategies, they lead to new plans, they lead to new objectives, new weapons acquisitions, deployments, and a lot of it becomes very, very specific to the threat perceptions. Now there is a major disconnect as far as Pakistan sees the Pakistani and Indian strategic threat perceptions. In Pakistan, the military feels that there is, in the context of the nuclear overhangs, there is no space, there is zero space for any conventional conflict or any outbreak of conflict. That war has to be avoided at all costs. All other instruments of national power must get preeminence. This is its doctrine, this is its avowed policy, and the military is tasked to ensure that that space does not exist. The reason why the military in Pakistan raised such a hue and cry on the cold start was because there was a limited window that the Indians were seeing below the nuclear threshold of the outbreak of conventional conflict. And Pakistan has quickly closed that, tried to close it according to its own thinking, by doing its own new war fighting, by bringing in the battlefield nuclear weapons, by introducing other mechanisms to shut down perhaps that window of opportunity. The message that we are sending is no conflict. It is deterrence that must be held at the conventional and the nuclear level both. On the Indian side, our understanding is that India thinks that there is, below this nuclear threshold, sufficient space for them to carry out limited operations and limited objectives. And therefore, this disconnect could lead to a spiral of violence and a spiral of activities and escalations that could find a nuclear interplay in times to come. There are ongoing disputes, and I will not talk about those in detail, except to say that with respect to Kashmir, with respect to Siachen, with respect to Sir Creek, the Pakistani military is flexible in finding a resolution. And while I think at the official level it may not be admitted, but I think there is a great feeling that it's willing to step down from the maximalist positions that it has had. And therefore, there are opportunities there for these solutions in these major issues that confront us. And my belief is that unless and until we tackle those major issues, these CBMs will remain just cosmetics. And these are baby steps that we cannot then make into giant leaps. And I'll just quote one example with regard to Siachen, which was doable, and Mr. Pandey mentioned in the morning, 1989 is 1989. Lots of developments have taken place and time has moved on. The trouble is, in 1989, Siachen was doable. Today, Siachen is no longer doable because the dynamics have changed. And if the dynamics change, the more delays that we incur in non-resolution of issues, I think the greater problem we have in actually finding solutions at the end of it. I would like to point out with regard to two other issues. One, I think we need to be conscious of the threat that water, dams, the debate, the sharing poses as a security challenge in the coming days. Also, I think we need to address the issues of Afghanistan and Balochistan, because Pakistan sees that as an Indian attempt at encirclement of Pakistan, just as India sees Pakistan as a Chinese attempt at encirclement of India. I think it would be safe to say that there are the psychological dimensions of the CBMs which are really assurances of intention. But in Pakistan, the military has learned to live with imbalance. And if I were to quote, I would say Pakistan military lives with imbalance as a means of balance. And that determines and dictates its strategy. While we've had these military-to-military contacts non-existent, there is this fragility in the environment that will reverse the process if we don't move it ahead. And we would like a long list of the existing CBMs have avoided major catastrophes and conflicts. They have worked. I think we need to strengthen those. And I will stop here to endorse a lot of the other points that were made by the Air Marshal, especially with regard to doing everything we can, one, to lower the mistrust, and also to initiate the MOD to MOD dialogue that he suggests. Because I, as the Secretary of Defense in 2005, actually mooted this directly to my counterpart, Mr. Vijay Singh, and Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, who was the High Commissioner at that time, was in partial agreement. And I said, let's conclude, because we were unable to do anything on Siachen at that meeting. I said, why don't we just let the two militaries shift to Lahore? We'll make the logistics, and let them talk to each other. They were partial to this suggestion, but they said they needed to get back to New Delhi and get the permissions or get an okay. That never came, and therefore it was staggered. I do think that that's the way to go forward, not perhaps at the track 2, but directly at the track 1.